Welcome to the lesson on probability, an experimental approach. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to define probability and its terms: trial, event, experiment, and outcome. You will also be able to list the steps to measure the chance of occurrence of a particular outcome.
I'm sure you must have heard or said statements such as these in your day-to-day life. The words likely, maybe, chances are, probably, and hope used in these statements involve an element of uncertainty or chance. These words are all synonyms used to indicate the term probability, which is an integral part of our life. I'm Probby. Together, let's explore the world of probability.
Let's look at this scenario. Remember the annual sports day when a lot of speculations were going around? In this scenario, each person is seen making different predictions that are related to the same situation. What do you think are the basis of these predictions? Do you think these predictions are based on intuition? Or are these a result of mere wishful thinking? No, the speakers have probably used their past experiences to predict the likely winner. They have used probability to make these predictions. So, how do we define probability? In simple terms, probability is defined as the likelihood of something occurring. Can you remember any other instances where the concept of probability is used? Let me help you recall. Remember the different board games such as Snakes and Ladders, Ludo, Tombola, and Monopoly? You must surely have played these with your friends. All these games involve probability. What about the popular game of cricket? It begins with the tossing of a coin, which involves probability. In mathematics, probability is defined as the numerical method of measuring uncertainty involved in a situation. An interesting thing to note about probability is that it started off with gambling, as there is an element of uncertainty in gambling. Probability is used extensively in the fields of physical science, commerce, biological science, medical science, and weather forecasting. Over the years, various activities have been performed to measure probability. Based on the results of these activities, experimental or empirical probability is calculated. We will understand the term experimental or empirical probability later in the lesson. First, let's observe two activities that will help us understand how probability is measured. In this activity, a coin is tossed in the air a number of times, and the corresponding observations are recorded. In the first set, the coin is tossed 5 times. As you can see, heads show up twice and tails show up thrice. Now, based on these values, let's write down the values in the next 2 columns. In the 4th column, the number of heads upon the total number of tosses is noted. In the fifth column, the number of tails upon the total number of tosses is noted. Next, the same activity is repeated by increasing the number of tosses to 10, 15, 20, and 25. The results obtained are as shown in the table. Now, let's calculate the cumulative results. We observe that the value of fractions are closer to 0.5 or half. From this, we can say that the probability of getting heads or tails is 0.5. Let's observe the results of another activity. Here, a die is thrown 10 times. The record of each outcome is noted in the table. Next, let's note the values of the fractions of the number of times a score turns up upon the number of throws of the die. Now, let's find the cumulative number of times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 turned up. We observe that the value of fractions are closer to 1 upon 6. We've seen two activities which are based on probability. In probability, these activities are called experiments. An experiment is defined as an action or process that results in well-defined outcomes. In the first experiment, a coin was tossed, and in the second experiment, a die was thrown. In both the experiments, each toss of the coin and each throw of the die are called a trial. Please note that even if the experiment involved more than one coin or die, it would still be called a trial. A trial is defined as an action which results in one or several outcomes. The possible outcomes in the first experiment are heads and tails, whereas the possible outcomes in the second experiment are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. In the first experiment, the occurrence of heads in a particular throw is an event with outcome heads. Similarly, getting tails is an event with outcome tails. In the second experiment, getting a particular number, say 1, is an event with outcome 1. So, an event for an experiment can be defined as the collection of some outcomes of the experiment. Now, let's understand the term experimental or empirical probability. Experimental or empirical probability is an estimate that an event will happen based on how often the event occurs after performing an experiment in a large number of trials. Please note that empirical probability is found on the basis of what we directly observe as the outcomes of our trials or experiment. In an experiment, let n be the total number of trials. The experimental or empirical probability, P of E, of an event E happening is equal to the number of trials in which the event happened divided by the total number of trials. For example, if a coin is tossed 1,000 times with the following frequencies, heads is equal to 476 and tails is equal to 524. The empirical probability of each event is calculated as shown here. The empirical probability of getting a head or P of H is equal to the number of heads divided by the total number of trials. In other words, P of H is equal to 476 divided by 1000. So the result is 0.476. Similarly, the empirical probability of getting a tail or P of T is equal to the number of tails divided by the total number of trials. In other words, P of T is equal to 524 divided by 1000. So the result is 0.524.